Good evening, everyone. We will give everyone just a few moments to get logged on and get comfortable, and then we will begin the program. Good evening. I am Cam Argetsinger, the Senior Manager of Public Engagement at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. And it is my honor on behalf of the King Center and the National Center for Civil and Human Rights to welcome you to Letter from Birmingham Jail, Experiencing a Single Garment of Destiny. We have a wonderful panel for you this evening and some great moderators who will guide this very important conversation about the importance of the letter then and now. It's also very fitting that we are having this discussion on International Human Rights Day, a day to uphold the worth and rights of all people throughout the world. Now, before I introduce the moderators, we would like to draw your attention to a few opportunities, such as purchasing the book Why We Can't Wait, which includes the letter from Birmingham Jail, and you can pick that up for purchase at thekingcenter.org. We also invite you to join the Campaign for Equal Dignity, and you can learn more about that at equaldignity.org. Also, visit our new website. We just launched it very recently, so we'd love for you to check it out and interact with us. And finally, just a friendly reminder that all comments of the moderators and guests of our programs represent the thoughts of each individual and do not represent an official position of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. With that, it is my honor to introduce our first moderator, Fatima Chaudhary. She is the lead instructor of nonviolence at the Martin Luther King Jr. Freedom Center. Welcome, Fatima.
Thank you for having me here.
Next up is Teos Nguyen. He is the Director of Nonviolence 365 Education and Training at the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change, or the King Center. Teos, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and welcome, everyone.
And with that, I will turn it over to our moderators. Enjoy the program.
Welcome to this panel, Letter from Birmingham Jail, Experiencing a Single Garment of Destiny. Let's begin with a brief description of the Birmingham campaign. The Birmingham campaign was organized by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. The campaign, which began on April 3rd, 1963, took place in the context of the nationwide civil rights movement. Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Alabama Christian Movement for Civil Rights developed a series of marches, rallies, and mass meetings as a nonviolent strategy to desegregate Birmingham and to integrate schools, hospitals, and businesses. On April 10th, 1963, Circuit Judge W.A. Jenkins Jr. issued a blanket injunction against parading, demonstrating, boycotting, trespassing, and picketing. Dr. King and the other campaign leaders announced that they would not adhere to the injunction. On April 12th, Dr. King, Reverend Ralph Abernathy, and Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth were arrested along with many others. Dr. King wrote the letter from Birmingham Jail as a response to an open letter from white clergy in Birmingham asking Dr. King to go slow and to wait for what they thought would be a more opportune time to demonstrate for integration. The letter was written from solitary confinement and smuggled out by Dr. King's lawyer. The letter says and conveys in clear and eloquent language the reasons why the Birmingham campaign could not wait and must go forward. Dr. King explained, the time is always ripe to do right. He points out the power of nonviolence as the best instrument to confront injustice and to bring about reconciliation, equity, and the beloved community. The letter from Birmingham Jail, in the process of outlining the purposes, strategies, and tactics of the Birmingham campaign, is also a document that provides valuable clarity for organizing for justice and human and civil rights. Indeed, as Dr. King puts it, an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Now I will turn it over to Teos for an introduction of the panelists.
Thank you so much, Fatima, and thank you for the introduction. In terms of our panelists, it is my honor to introduce the panelists that will be joining us tonight, and I really feel as though you all are definitely in for a treat. First up, we have Dr. Clayborne Carson. Dr. Clayborne Carson is the Centennial Professor of History and Ronnie Lott Founding Director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute at Stanford University. Dr. Carson has devoted most of his professional life to the study of Martin Luther King Jr. and the movements King inspired. Since receiving his doctorate from UCLA in 1975, Dr. Carson has taught at Stanford University, where he is now the Martin Luther King Jr. Centennial Professor of History and Ronnie Lott Founding Director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute. Welcome, Dr. Clayborne Carson.
Good to be here.
Thank you, sir. Our next guest joining us today will be Dr. Susannah Heschel. Dr. Susannah Heschel is the Eli M. Black Distinguished Professor and Chair of the Jewish Studies Program at Dartmouth College. She is the author of several books on German Jewish history and has published over 100 scholarly articles. She has received 4 honorary degrees and has held research grants from the Carnegie Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the National Humanities Center, and more. Tonight, we welcome with us Dr. Susannah Heschel.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
Thank you so much for joining us. And now we have Ambassador Andrew J. Young. Ambassador Young has earned worldwide recognition as a pioneer and champion of civil and human rights. Ambassador Young's lifelong dedication to service is illustrated by his extensive leadership experience of over 65 years serving as a member of Congress, African-American U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Mayor of Atlanta, and ordained minister, among many other positions. During the 1960s, Young was a key strategist and negotiator during civil rights campaigns that led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He was later appointed as ambassador to the United Nations, and he has also served 2 terms as mayor of Atlanta. Welcome so much, Ambassador Andrew Young.
Thanks a lot.
And our final panelist joining us today is Dr. Bernice King, CEO of the King Center. Dr. Bernice King is a global thought leader, orator, peace advocate, and CEO of the King Center, which was founded by her mother, Coretta Scott King. From this position, the same one held by her mother, Dr. King continues to advance her parents' legacy of Kingian nonviolence, which she has rebranded as Nonviolence 365. Through her work at the center, she educates youth and adults around the world about the nonviolent principles modeled by her parents. Under her leadership, the center has implemented numerous initiatives, such as the annual Camp Now Leadership Academy, Nonviolence 365 trainings, Beloved Community Talks, just to name a few. Welcome, Dr. Bernice A. King.
Thank you so much, and I'm honored to be a part of this conversation tonight.
Thank you so much. And now we'll turn it back to Fatima for the opening question.
Thank you, Teos, and thank you again to all the panelists for being here and discussing your thoughts on the Birmingham letter. This is a question for all of the panelists. As we survey the world in which Dr. King has described as the world house in which we must learn to live together, with the persistence of racism, poverty, and other forms of violence, what do you believe is the most relevant teaching from the letter from Birmingham Jail? Dr. Carson, let's start with you.
Well, I think at first we would have to say how important that letter was in terms of his life and the history of the Black freedom struggle. I think he was at a crucial turning point. He had been in Albany and not succeeded as well as he expected. And going to Birmingham was like leaving one hot spot and going to an even hotter spot where Birmingham was the name given to Birmingham. So I think he understood what was at stake, that this was a time when the movement needed to address these issues in terms that the nation could not avoid. He wrote the letter at a time when the outcome of the Birmingham campaign was still undetermined. We now know that, yes, he came out with what could be called a victory, and he was invited to give the final address at the March on Washington, but none of that was evident going into the Birmingham campaign. And then to be criticized by ministers, I think that is for him something that he just simply had to respond to. And I think the lasting importance of that is that it tells us that the letter allows us to say that we need to look to our conscience in order to decide how to bring about change, to allow the militancy of nonviolence. And that might be somewhat of a contradiction, but I think that you can have militant nonviolence, and that the call for moderation, the question of whether there's just laws and unjust laws, all of these were crucial questions that he had to address. And I think the remarkable thing is that the letter is just as relevant today as it was when he wrote it.
Wonderful. We'll turn it now over to Dr. Heschel for your thoughts.
Thank you. I agree with Dr. Carson. The letter is extremely relevant today. Absolutely. And I would say what's especially important, there's several factors I would pick out. One is that we all have to come together, that we need alliances with one another. I think it was Bernice Reagan who once said, if all of your allies agree with you, then you're not in alliance. So how do we come together? I also would like to point out what Dr. Carson said about nonviolence. That nonviolence is not just a matter of not hitting back when someone hits me. Nonviolence also meant a different way of thinking. It was a training of the mind and a training of the spirit, and it created a different kind of personality. It wasn't something that comes naturally, let's say, to somebody, because the people involved in the civil rights movement underwent a special training, often at the Highlander Center, a training of the spirit, of the heart and soul, because it's the inner life that then is conveyed in an exterior way by not fighting, hitting back. So that, I think, is very precious. I might also just point out that there was a rabbi in Birmingham, Rabbi Milton Grafman, who was white and head of a congregation, a synagogue, and he was considered by the white community to be at the forefront of civil rights efforts in support of Dr. King. And yet he is one of the white clergy who signed the initial letter of the white clergy asking Dr. King to moderate, to wait. So sometimes we also have to consider how we are perceived by different groups. Dr. Grafman may have been perceived at the forefront, but he really wasn't. And then finally, I would say what's important about the letter is to say, sometimes you can't sit back and wait. There are times when it's not appropriate to take a back seat or to be moderate or to slow down. On the contrary, sometimes the conscience that we have pushes us forward. And that's Dr. King's message, and I think it's extremely relevant today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Heschel. And now we'll turn it over to Ambassador Young for thoughts.
Well, let me go back to Albany, because Albany was a movement that was not intended or planned. Dr. King was invited to give a speech by one of his classmates from Morehouse, and everybody got sort of freedom high, and because of the big turnout, and Dr. Anderson announced who's going to march with Dr. King to jail. And everybody wanted to go, and he went. but it was not his intention, nor was there any planning. So that was also stopped by an injunction that we felt was inspired by the federal government. Because it was a federal court injunction, and that's why we stopped the Albany movement. We didn't intend it, and we were glad to get out of it. But when we went to Birmingham the next year, we actually, you mentioned April, but Wyatt Walker started going to Birmingham right after Dr. King's birthday in January. And he started meeting with the preachers. Fred Shuttlesworth's church had been bombed 3 times. There was some 62 bombings of people's homes in Birmingham in 1961 and 1962. And it wasn't even in the papers in Atlanta, 150 miles away. So we really had almost 3 months of preparation. And Dr. King had actually met with some of the signers of this ad condemning him. And we met in the Episcopal Diocesan House. We explained to them how our nonviolent movement would work, and that it was really based on our non-cooperation with the evil of segregation. And before the letter was written, we had almost 100% compliance. Nobody Black was buying anything but food or medicine from January right on through almost to June when it was settled. And so there had been investigation, there had been negotiations and discussions, and list of goals had been presented to the business community at the Episcopal Diocesan House. And all of that was done before demonstrations started. So the Birmingham letter was written in the context of people with whom Dr. King had already met, and who, in spite of our discussions and our boycott starting, they still insisted on condemning him after what had actually been a very cordial discussion that continued throughout the movement. There was a negotiation that went on right straight through every day with a different group of businessmen. And so in that context, the letter from the Birmingham Jail took the issues worldwide.
Thank you, Ambassador Young. And finally, let's have Bernice, Dr. Bernice King, your thoughts.
Yes, I want to agree with Dr. Heschel and Carson, and of course, I call him Uncle Andy.
That's all right.
Ambassador Young, this letter is okay. This letter is extremely relevant, all of it, to our lives today. I think it transcends time. I like to say it's comparable to one of the letters that Paul wrote to many of the churches in the New Testament. And I want to just point out a couple of things. First, holistically, the letter is a testament to my father's commitment to nonviolence holistically as a way of life. The way he wrote the letter, the language, the way in which he ensured that in speaking his truth, he left people with their dignity. And that's always important when you're waging a campaign against those that are mean-spirited, that are hateful. And so I think that's one of the most important things today, because I think our society and culture today tends to kind of fire to fire. When people speak in very undignified ways, we tend to respond in like kind. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I want to just spend a moment on, because it's extremely relevant to today's culture of protest movements. I often say that we have to be careful with the utilization of direct action today, because we can water it down. We can almost render it insignificant and cause people to kind of dismiss direct action. And so he took his time in explaining why direct action, the purpose of direct action. And I know through the King Center, we teach people about the 6 principles of nonviolence, as well as the 6 steps of nonviolence. Although the letter speaks to the 4 steps, the center further developed that out of those steps, there were 2 others. When you read most of his writings, you understand that his ultimate goal was about reconciliation and the creation of the beloved community. And so that's one of the final steps that he doesn't mention here, but that's all a part of what these steps are about. And then the education aspect, which is kind of embedded in information gathering, but the education of everybody holistically. But he explained direct action, which is the 5th step that we teach through the King Center of nonviolence. And oftentimes we start our campaigns against injustice at the 5th step without recognizing the importance of the previous steps to developing a pathway to the beloved community. And so he explains very clearly that direct action is a part of a campaign. It's a critical part. It's the part that creates such a crisis, in his words, and fosters such a tension that a community that has refused to engage in negotiation is kind of forced to address the issue. And so the purpose of direct action is really to get people to a table of negotiation, or if there was negotiation previously, to bring people back to the table of negotiation. And so I wanted to point that out because it's very relevant today, that people understand that it really is, direct action is a strategy to be used at an appropriate time. Now, there are moments where direct action always, should I say, dramatizes an issue. And so sometimes for the purpose of dramatizing an issue, you utilize direct action. But you also have to carefully understand that the nonviolent approach is not just about dramatizing and bringing out into the open, as direct action does, the issue. It's also about ensuring that you're conducting your action in a way that you're really trying to get from negotiation to reconciliation. And so I think those are key points to point out. And then finally, as a fifth generation minister, he's the 4th generation, I'm in the 5th generation of ministers. I want to just speak for a moment about the relevancy of what he spoke about concerning the church. I think if I had to say anything about this letter obviously could be written today to the white church, particularly the evangelical church, because the evangelical church has taken a hands-off approach to all of the social and racial inequities in our society. And it's a call, to them, I believe, in this time to come out of the confines of the safety of their spaces, their faith spaces, to become involved in the movement of justice. You know, what does the Lord require of thee but to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God? And so I too, for years, have been disappointed in the laxity, in the disengagement of the white church in the role of being at the forefront and being, as Daddy said, a thermostat rather than a thermometer. And so I would say for today's church, white church and all the Black churches even, that have not been a part of what we call the social gospel, that's who Christ was. That's the extreme nature of Christ. That love is not just something that you feel and that you say, but you act it out in ways that you show care and concern and compassion for the least of these, and also those who suffer great oppression and exploitations in society.
Thank you, Dr. King. Such powerful, high-powered responses from all of you. I can completely agree that this letter transcends time and that it is still very much relevant to the concepts and to the action that needs to be taken today. Then this next question is for you, Dr. Carson. You have said that King initially intended the Birmingham letter as a response to the 8 clergymen, but it became the most cognate and influential defense of nonviolent resistance ever written. Could you advance on this statement to us, Dr. Carson?
Well, I think as Dr. King has pointed out, these issues are continuing issues. Since the beginning of American history, I see Martin Luther King carrying on this dialogue. You know, one of the ways of looking at his I Have a Dream speech is he was carrying on a dialogue with Thomas Jefferson. You know, when he's talking about what is the meaning of the Declaration of Independence? When are you going to live up to that? So he always felt that his job was to challenge those to live up to their own ideals. And I think as again, Dr. King has pointed out, you know, churches have a special role. One of the speeches that King gave late in his life was right before the Poor People campaign, and probably Andrew Young remembers this, and it might have shocked his staff, because he said that Christianity has a more revolutionary message than Marxism. Mm-hmm. And he said if the Christian church did lived up to its own values, I think he was suggesting that Marxism as a revolutionary ideology would have been unnecessary. Mm. And I think that what he's always doing is challenging people to live up to the values that they say they have, that this country says it has. You know, I look upon the King Memorial in Washington. He's right across the tidal basin. It's mm-hmm. right from the Jefferson Memorial. And I think of that as kind of this continual dialogue. What is the meaning of this country? We think of ourselves as the land of the free, but are we really? Are we living up to the values that we purport to represent in the world? So I think for that reason, another way of putting this is his last question was, where do we go from here? He's always asking a question that is still unanswered. Where do we go? And the complacency that we see among many people that, oh, these were battles that were fought back in the 1960s. Well, we don't have to read the morning newspapers to know that these issues, poverty, the inequities in the society, they are still with us today.
Thank you, Dr. Carson. That's I've heard you say that many times. Where do we go from here? And you've asked it almost from everybody that you speak to, you ask them that question. Where do we go from here? And in some ways, and in many ways, we are still finding the answer to that question. Permit me to ask a follow-up question of you, Dr. Carson. In my research through the Birmingham campaign, I learned about the Children's Crusade, where many of the youth were put and arrested into jail, and it actually turned the tide of the campaign. So my follow-up question is, how would you interpret the blueprint of the Birmingham campaign and Dr. King's letter for us as youth to apply in a more practical sense so that we can be a part of this nonviolent pressure towards our public institutions and our government institutions in answering the question that Dr. King and you have constantly asked, where do we go from here?
Well, I've been so proud of what young people have done during the last couple of decades. One of the things that is so remarkable is that just days after the murder of George Floyd, a movement larger than the March on Washington by many factors was created within a few days. So I think what young people have been able to do is say, yes, these issues have been with us for a long time, police brutality and all of that, but we want something to be done, and we want it done urgently. And they were able to mobilize Americans in a way that reminded me of the mid-1960s. So I think that perhaps one of the things that they've done is, the reference to the fierce urgency of now. I think many of us who are older had become somewhat complacent. And I'm not exactly sure that if we had relied on people over 30 to respond to George Floyd's death, that we would have had the movement that we saw last summer. So I think I'm very hopeful. I think that the letter also, as Dr. King has already pointed out, is also a cautionary note that you have to prepare yourself for that struggle. You have to think it through. And I think many young people like yourself, you are a prime example of those who are thinking it through. So I'm very hopeful for the future. And I think if Martin Luther King were with us today, he would be applauding what is happening and just say, this is just the beginning.
Thank you. And completely agree that it responds to the urgency of now. King says himself, the time is always right to do right. And that time itself is actually neutral. We can use it constructively or destructively. So thank you, Dr. Carson. This next question is for Dr. Susannah Heschel. Dr. Heschel, your father, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, greatly influenced Dr. King. As Ambassador Andrew Young has said, if you notice Martin Luther King's speeches, he quotes from the prophets written by your father, more than almost anyone else. He got many of those insights from the study of Rabbi Heschel. Please share with the audience about your father's relationship with Dr. King, and tell us what you think the letter from Birmingham Jail reflects the core beliefs that Rabbi Heschel and Dr. King shared, especially in relation to their beliefs regarding faith and social justice.
Thank you for the question. I'd like to just put it a little bit first in a historical context. My father was born in Poland and studied in Germany from 1927 until 1938 when he was deported. He was there, in other words, when Hitler came to power. But it was during his time in Germany that he wrote a doctoral dissertation about the prophets. And his dissertation asked the question, what do the prophets experience when they receive a message from God? What is the consciousness of being a prophet? What is the religious experience of a prophet? What is their inner life? My father came to the United States in March of 1940. His family was killed, his mother, 3 of his sisters. That whole world that he had grown up in was destroyed in Europe. And I think it was extraordinary for my father to meet Dr. King for the first time in 1963 at a conference in Chicago. And the way they came together, the way they bonded. And they bonded over the Bible, over their understanding of the spirit of the Bible, and especially over the prophets. And I just have to point out to you that when my father was in Germany in the 1930s, there were Protestant theologians who said that the Old Testament is a Jewish book and has no place in the Christian Bible in Nazi Germany. So they literally eliminated the Old Testament from church readings. And then my father comes to the United States, and Dr. King is making the Hebrew Bible, the Exodus, and the prophets the central text of the civil rights movement. And that was incredible, extraordinary for my father. And I have to say, in so many ways, the civil rights movement was also an ecumenical movement. It brought in young Jews, rabbis, and I think it restored our faith. It restored our souls after the war. It gave us a sense of pride in our Bible and in our Judaism. And for my father, the civil rights movement was also a religious experience. So when he came back from marching in Selma, my father said, I felt my legs were praying.
Wow.
So pray by marching. This was something quite special and extraordinary. And I'm glad that my father's book on the prophets, which he translated into English in 1961, that this book was so popular. And I know that Ambassador Young has said that everybody had a copy of the prophets of my father's book in their hip pocket. And I'm happy about that. But I think that what they both understood, Dr. King and my father, was that the message of the prophets is that God is full of passion and responds to us. And God cares about us. And God hears our suffering and feels it with us. That was the special understanding that my father derived in his study of the prophets, that was their message, that God is responding to human beings and suffering with us and also rejoicing with us. And there is, in the words of the prophets, a divine command, a divine command that you are responsible for one another. And that there is no such thing as being complete. And that some are guilty, he said, but all are responsible. So I think it was over the Hebrew prophets that my father and Dr. King came together. And I have to say, personally, as a professor of religion now, it's thanks to Dr. King that I fell in love with the Bible.
Thank you, Dr. Heschel. You pointed out that God is looking over us. He is watching over us. And I think one foundational thing that comes across every religion is that we have this notion that, yes, God is looking out for us and he has this bigger plan. And we as human beings, we can create this idea inside of our heads that the time will come that eventually God will answer all of our prayers. And that leads me to ask this follow-up question of you, Dr. Heschel, is how do you advise that we struggle with our personal faiths, whether we be Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and find the intersectionality that it has towards our work in social justice? Because as humans, we also have the right to act. We also have the right to choose how we are going to live our lives, whether or not we are praying or whether or not we are being religious. What is your advice on that, Dr. Heschel?
So my father made a distinction here, and he said, people of different faiths may not agree on points of doctrine. Christians have certain beliefs about Jesus, and Jews don't share those beliefs, but that's not what matters. He said, what matters is the religiosity. It's the struggle that we sometimes experience, the struggle to realize what it is, how hard it is sometimes to believe, to pray. My father urged us to think not only about how we as human beings understand God, but to look from God's point of view. How does God look at us and see us? God creates this beautiful world, wonderful human beings, and how do we behave toward one another? Look from God's point of view and experience, and to think about what our responsibility should be for God. So the issue for us, whether we're Jews, Christians, Muslims, of course we need one another. And there are ways in which we can help one another with our own struggles in faith, in prayer, in devotion, in the search for what does God want from me as a human being, as an individual, because each of us is the only unique, extraordinary one person in the whole world. Each one is unique. What is my mandate to carry out in this precious life I've been given? So hopefully we help one another. We uplift one another's spirits in moments of despair and rejoice with one another when we accomplish what we need to do in this world.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Heschel. And you're exactly right. I think now more than ever, we definitely have the need to uplift one another and uplift humanity at large. And so thank you so much, Dr. Heschel, for that. And now this next question is for Ambassador Andrew Young. Ambassador Young, now you have a very unique experience in that you actually helped plan and execute the Birmingham campaign, which the letter from Birmingham Jail would come out of. What impact would you say the letter had on those around you and yourself when the letter was published?
Well, it had almost no impact.
Wow.
We didn't even get to read it, and we didn't even appreciate it. I mean, one of the most frustrating things about the movement was that Dr. King wrote it around the margin of the New York Times and on toilet paper. And the young lady that was typing it up, and I was right there with her and didn't know any better. I didn't think about it, but she'd ask me, she'd say, Dr. King can speak, but he sure can't write. I said, well, he's writing around the margin of the newspaper. She said, well, what is this word? And I helped her translate it, and she'd finish a page, and then she'd bundle it up and throw it in the trash can. And I mean, it was the stupidest thing that's ever happened to me in life. But we really didn't appreciate who we were and what we were doing. Now, let me go back a little bit, though, because we did know how important it was to train. And Fatima said something about the Children's March, and I always resent that because I think of children as being somebody under 12. We worked with high school students who were juniors and seniors, and we started training them in January. And by the time they had gone to jail, they had taken part in a demonstration. They had seen the movie of Gandhi and the Indian independence. They had seen the Montgomery bus boycott, and they had seen the movie on the Nashville sit-in story, and they had discussed it. They had read Nonviolent Action, which was a little Quaker pamphlet that talked about the stages of nonviolence. He also went visiting to the bars and the pool halls. And Dick Gregory came down and joined us, and Dr. King went around. And before any demonstration started, we preached to the so-called bad boys in town. Look, if you're not going to be nonviolent, stay out. Our movement depends on our standing for and controlling nonviolence. Now, we want you to go, but we don't want any of this sideline action taking advantage of the confusion and of the disorder in a demonstration to break windows or to steal things. And so we really had organized the town, and it was these young people meeting after school. See, back then we didn't have television, so people had nothing much to do. So they'd go from school to several churches that we had set up near the schools, and we would teach them about nonviolence. Now, let me just add one more thing to what Susannah Heschel had to say, is that there was a natural connection between Christianity and Judaism, especially Black Christianity, because all of our music, tell old Pharaoh to let our people go. Ezekiel saw the wheel. Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, coming to all of our songs had basically an Old Testament theme to it. But we also had learned to understand Jesus. I always say that Gandhi made me a Christian. That Gandhi read Jesus and turned Jesus' message into a doctrine of social change. and nonviolence and loving your enemies and turning the other cheek had real meaning to it because Gandhi had put it into action. Dr. King later on got very closely involved with the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh. And that was one of the reasons why he felt that we had to oppose the war in Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of this background, but especially there were children out there in the park, but everybody that was in our demonstration, if they were under 14, they had to be with their parents or have a letter from their parents. Now, in the chaos, lots happened. But it was David Halberstam that called the Nashville sit-in story a children's crusade. And they were all college students and at least 18, most of them, and were old enough to go to war and get killed for somebody else's freedom. And so part of our message was, you're old enough and you're wise enough and mature enough to start thinking about your own freedom and the freedom of your families and your communities.
Right. Wow. Some really powerful information there. And I know you've shared before that the civil rights movement was very much so a faith-driven movement. One follow-up question for you, Ambassador Young. You touched on something really powerful. You talked about what the movement depended on and how the movement depended on nonviolence specifically. My follow-up question to you is, what do you feel the success of today's movement, once again, with young people or inspired by the actions of young people, what do you feel like the success of today's movement depends on?
Well, we had almost nothing to say about today's movement. Today's movement, Black Lives Matter, in this generation, this age, was started when all of us at home, not in school, not in the office, because of the virus, had to watch a young man die for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And I think that one scene made the overwhelming, volume of our population say, I don't want to be a part of this kind of action. And so we had people not necessarily organized, but there was a spontaneous movement that even went all the way down I saw people as far as New Zealand marching for Black Lives Matter, and in many places in Europe and Africa, and it was a global movement. But what happened was it really focused without us saying it, or maybe even understanding it. Dr. King said this movement was about the triple evils of racism, war, and poverty. And there's no question to me that there was racism involved. But George Floyd's death was not only racism. That was some sickness that's going to come out later on. I don't know what it is. But the response that we've gotten, say, Citicorp did a study saying that discrimination is unprofitable, that the discriminating against minorities and women from 2000 to 2020 cost the economy $16.5 trillion. Mm-hmm. And that was the thing that really won in Birmingham. It was the boycott that, with people not buying anything but food and medicine for 90 days, the economy shut down. Black Lives Matter shut down the economy with the help of the coronaviruses. And the discussion of that virus brought out a concept that I love, because it wasn't just Black Lives Matter. We started talking about essential workers. And the essential workers were doctors and nurses in hospitals, but they were also sanitation workers who picked up the garbage. You can't have a healthy city if you don't have adequate garbage collection. You can't run a city without clean water.
Right.
And if the water's polluted, the population is polluted. And so you had a lot of economic issues and infrastructure issues. And the fact that the virus shut down business means that the next administration is going to have an elaborate recovery plan. And we're going to have to deal with the essential workers. And it can't just, we tried that top down. Right. And we gave the top 2% $1.5 trillion tax cut. And nothing happened. They put it into stocks and Wall Street looked good. But if you put that $1.5 trillion, say, into student loans, right, you'd wipe out student debt completely. But I guarantee you, every penny of that would go to start a business, to buy a home, to improve their education. And you would have the economy being developed from the bottom up, which is the only way to develop an economy.
Wow.
So they are, I think, maybe even unconsciously fulfilling the third phase of the movement as we define it: racism, war. But this is going to focus us on poverty without just talking about poor people.
Right.
Now, the concept of essential workers means people who are essential to the survival of our economy.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. And this next question is for you, Dr. Bernice A. King. So, Dr. King, in a June 2020 interview, you pointed out that every generation is called to this freedom struggle. How have your father's teachings on in demonstration of nonviolence, even in how he responded to the statement from the 8 Alabama clergy in the letter from Birmingham Jail, influenced your own activism and leadership? What is the role you see nonviolence playing in the freedom struggles that we face this very day?
Wow, that's a lot to answer. And I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to try to do it as brief as possible. I was a hothead growing up in my family. My emotions ruled. When something happened, I was angry about anything, an injustice, a wrongdoing. I felt that there was a need to lash out and retaliate within my, in my being. My father, and not just my father, I have to bring up my mother, because Dr. King is who he is and his iconic stature today because of my mom, to be frank. It was their example of nonviolence, not just the teachings of it, but their congruency with it. And me having the experience of my mother and being able to see her examples of how she handled things and conducted things that really influenced my leadership. And then reading more deeply my father as I became the leader of the Nonviolent Institution for Social Change, I had to begin to really take serious the teachings of my father, and so deeply appreciate him being a leader who didn't just espouse a certain way of thinking or a philosophy, but he literally embodied that philosophy. And for him, it was a way of life. And when you study him, I say that over and over again. When you study him, when you talk to the people like Ambassador Young and others who knew him, he was sincerely and authentically committed to nonviolence as a way of living. And we don't see enough of that. People use it as a tactic. And I have now adopted that notion and believe that it is the only way to really bring about effective social change, and even changes in our interpersonal relationships. So he helped to widen my way of approaching our social issues, our personal problems, and helped to inspire me to really operate out of my spirit self and to see nonviolence in a more moral vein, and to truly understand the ultimate goal. Because for my father, it was always about that ultimate goal of the beloved community. And that's where my heart and soul is now, not because of him, but because I have come to that in having a deep and profound respect for what I have seen as the results of nonviolence in this way. And, you know, Daddy talked about it being the answer when you asked me about the second question to the crucial political and moral questions of our time. I mean, today, Uncle Andy talked about essential workers and how vital and critical they are to our economy. I say nonviolence is the heart and soul and the lifeline of the salvation of our world. When he spoke in his speech accepting the Nobel Peace Prize, the lecture, and also he mentioned this in his book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, in the last chapter, The World House, that the philosophy and strategy of nonviolence must immediately become a subject of study and serious experimentation in every field of human conflict, not excluding conflicts between nations. And so nonviolence is essential to any social movement, any movement for racial and social equity in our world, because violence, as we know, is a descending spiral. It only begets violence. It multiplies, as Dad says, evil and violence in the universe, and frankly, doesn't solve any problems. It's just a knee-jerk reaction. It's a human reaction that we have out of our own, fears, sometimes frustrations, as Daddy said, the language of the unheard. But at the end of the day, it does not create a pathway to permanent and lasting and sustainable change. And there's been studies done about violent movements versus nonviolent movements. And it is proven through data that nonviolence is the best, and I would say the only pathway to creating the beloved community, but it's absolutely the only pathway to creating sustainable change. And so it is essential to our time today, and it is a discipline. So that's how I sum it up. My parents influenced me to discipline my emotions. We will have those emotions, but nonviolence gives us a context, and it gives us a practical way as well to address those things that we are feeling, to channel them into something that is much more constructive and can bring about lasting and permanent change.
Wow. And Dr. King, I know that we've talked about the youth a lot in this conversation. I know you personally have a huge heart for the youth and making sure that this message of nonviolence translates and does not get lost, but can be exercised for generations to come. What would you say is critical in terms of making sure that this next generation has this nonviolence pathway to follow moving forward?
Not to be a little selfish in my presentation, but I really believe that young people coming through the trainings that we do is very vital. We are very serious about ensuring that people understand utilizing the steps or the strategies of nonviolence are more effective in terms of their long-lasting implications and creating an environment for the beloved community if you truly understand the principles of nonviolence. You cannot utilize the steps absent the principles. They work together, hand in hand. And so while you're doing each one of those steps, you have to keep in mind that nonviolence is courageous, that nonviolence seeks to win friendship and understanding. Nonviolence doesn't seek to defeat people. That means that as we saw in the letter, my father's language was not language that was trying to denigrate those who had attacked him. It really was to uplift their human personality, but yet speak truth to the issues that they raised. And so that training is so vital and essential. And I know that there's this, atmosphere where we're accustomed to doing things so quickly in this generation. But if we can just spend the necessary time, young people can spend the necessary time, like I have. I was once young. As I said, I was kind of like hothead. This needs to happen now, and I'm not saying there's not a fierce urgency now, because we talk about that. Right. But what I'm saying is, in our urgency, we have to be very intentional, deliberate, and strategic, and we have to plan. They planned Birmingham. I was fascinated when I went back and read Why Do We Go From Here? And as Uncle Andy mentioned, Y.T. Walker going into Birmingham. Y.T. Walker literally studied the city codes, on demonstrations and on picketing. He looked at the bail bond system. He went to the downtown stores and mapped it out. How many stools, how many lunch counters, where the ingresses and the egresses. These things are all vital when you're talking about waging a nonviolent campaign for social change, but it's also about waging a campaign that recognizes that the ultimate goal is reconciliation and the creation of the beloved community. So you don't see those people really as your enemy. The issues are the enemy. Those people, regardless of who they are still a part of our human family. And our role and responsibility is to win them over and not win over them. And so it's really about a victory for justice and freedom. And as my mother said, that ongoing struggle is going to be with every generation. And we win it, but we're not going to get to the ultimate win in any one generation, because every generation has to make its contribution to the freedom struggle. And the way to effectively do that is to really immerse yourself in not just nonviolent action, but the nonviolent, as my sister said, Susannah Heschel, it's the thinking. We have to shift our thinking.
Wow.
That influences our behavior.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bernice King. And now at this point, I'll take it to Fatima for questions from the audience. I think you're muted. Can you hear me, Fatima?
Yes, I think I've been unmuted now. Thank you, Teos, and thank you to all the viewers that are watching today. And thank you for all the panelists for your deep and profound responses to all the questions so far. One of the core, I think one of the many things that we've talked about today is faith and its intersectionality with how we approach social justice and how we approach the work in social justice. So before I answer this question, I want to, in a sense, globalize it. An audience member asked, why can someone be so involved with the church and its teachings but doesn't show the compassion and all the things that Jesus spoke of. And I'd like to ask, in a deeper context, how can one be so personally attached to their own personal teachings or personal faith and do one thing but not act on the other? If all of we can start with, I'd like to start with you, Dr. Susannah Heschel. I believe you're muted.
Well, I think the host will unmute me, right? Can you hear me? So, yeah, I think there are some people who use their faith to pat themselves on the back, to feel good. I know my father used to say that if you go to the synagogue, this experience should be subversive. Prayer should be subversive. It should shake you up and not allow you to feel complacent. You should leave the synagogue or church or mosque and not pat yourself on the back and say, look how good I was. No, on the contrary, it's to unsettle us. What else can I be doing? What should I be doing? To question the way we're living. So indeed, that is an issue. I remember Dr. King once said that that there are some people who hide behind the stained glass windows. That's not what we want to do. He said, of course, then there are those who are at the forefront and who are in fact marching. And yes, I would say, and marching is a form of prayer. So our religious lives are not simply something at the moment we're saying a prayer. It's all day, every day. And how do we transform what we do to turn our lives into a prayer?
Thank you, Dr. Susannah Heschel. Ambassador Young, what are your thoughts?
Don't mind, because the source of nonviolence in her family, I don't think is her daddy or on her daddy's side even. It was her grandfather on her mother's side, her mother's father, because when Coretta was 15, she came home from church choir practice in the middle of the week to find her house burned down. And her father was there waiting, and he made them stand together and pray. And the first thing they prayed for was to thank God that none of them were in the house. The second thing they prayed for was the sick people who felt it necessary to burn down their house. And the third thing he prayed for was that they never have any bitterness or malice in their hearts because against these people. And that's where the two grandfathers of Dr. King came together, because Daddy King said all the time, hate is too great a burden to bear. He said that over and over again. I can't let any man make me hate him. But Coretta's father taught her that at 15. And that was probably somewhere back in the 1940s. So that there's something among spiritual people that have realized that nonviolence is a survival skill. The Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. I mean, you got story after story. That's another thing that somebody just said to me the other day that about slavery, that Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery, and because they were jealous of his coat of many colors, and he ended up saving Egypt and feeding his brother. And I think it's Reverend Forbes, who was at Riverside Church, preached about this, that if Joseph was not sold into slavery, he was sent into slavery to save Egypt. And the implication of that for me is when I start raising the question of why was I brought to this, my parents and ancestors brought to this country as slaves. Yes, they were probably sold. But when you look at it spiritually, were we being sent by God for just such a time as this to find ways to save the planet from itself, from global warming, from pandemics, from greed, from hatred, poverty? There is a calling here.
Thank you, Ambassador Young. And Dr. King, your thoughts?
I hope I can remember the question. So if I end up not answering it, you'll know that I didn't remember the question.
Would you like to repeat it for you?
Yes, please.
Wonderful. It is, the question is, how can we as individuals who practice a faith, any religious faith, follow some parts and not other parts where it asks us to lend ourselves to compassion and the fight for justice?
You know, I think everything starts when you're a child. We have a responsibility to not just teach the words of our holy scriptures to those in our faith tradition, but we have a responsibility to model those out holistically. The reason I'm able to be who I am today, honestly, is because of, as Ambassador Young said, mostly because of my mom, vicariously my father, but mostly because my mother was an extraordinary example of the word becoming flesh and dwelling in my midst. And that was because I was a kid. I had the benefit of watching her. I remember so often when my mother would say, I don't hold grudges, but she was just not mouthing these pious notions. She was living it out in front of me because I saw the incidences where, she was offended or mistreated, and yet she did not hold on to the pain of that situation and become unloving and unforgiving. So I think that's one of the most important things that we have to begin to do, is to start at youth. Some of us who are a little bit older, it may be too late to ensure that people are living out the whole aspect of their faith and not just, picking off bits and pieces, to satisfy their own, selfish pursuits.
Thank you, Dr. Bernice King. Now back to Teos. I'd like to give it back to you to ask the last final audience question.
Sure. So the last question is really referring to bridging the gap. And the question speaks to how can we as individuals assist in bridging the current gaps that we see within the country right now? What can we do to assist in bridging the gaps? And we'll begin with you, Dr. Heschel.
Cameron.
We can unmute.
There we go.
It's quite a big question, and we are in a very difficult time. I think some of us feel that this is the worst time ever, and some of us remember a bit of history. What can we do? I think actually that Dr. Bernice King spoke to this earlier, and also Ambassador Young, in talking about setting goals and realizing that Dr. Martin Luther King in his Birmingham letter was explaining that the issues are the enemy, not the people who were telling him moderate, be quiet, and so forth.
Right.
Perhaps we need to keep that in mind as well and see if there are any ways we can find something in common with those who disagree. Are there any values and any principles that we can find in common as the starting point. But I also think we need to challenge and we need to speak what we believe and state it clearly. This is where I stand. This is what I believe. These are my principles, and these are my prophets. And I am quoting here the words of the Bible, and I stand for that. So there's also a matter of conscience. I have to speak my conscience and articulate it clearly and well. I don't expect people to come to an agreement right away, to overcome difficulties immediately, but I also think it's very helpful sometimes to plant a seed here and there, plant an idea, and hopefully people will come to recognize it may take a little time. But I also want to be sure that looking back 10, 20, 50 years from now, that we will have spoken our truth and made it clear and done it in a way that's respectful and reasonable, because indeed the other side is not the enemy. The issues are the enemy. I appreciate that very much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Dr. King, what are your thoughts?
Wow. Outside of what Susannah said, I would say that we have to first ask, how did we get to this place of being so divided or having this gap? You and I won a conversation the other day with the King Center talking about bridging the divides, a post-election conversation from the King Center. And if you remember, Delise Drain brought up this historical aspect around Willie Lynch syndrome, and going back to the beginning of how a lot of this stuff began to create these divisions in our society. So part of what she said with the truth is, the truth requires us to go back because we've been miseducated. The miseducation of all of us in this nation has led to a lot of division. And then the propaganda that feeds into all of that has further fed it. And so we have to be wedded to a process of truth telling, as Brian Stevenson is on a mission to do. And I know some of us are joining in that mission with him from the Center for Civil and Human Rights, the King Center, and the Carter Center, because it's vital and essential. I mean, you cannot start from a faulty foundation. You cannot engage if we don't expose the myths and the lies. And so I think part of that process is being committed to this truth telling and going back to the very foundation, and then committing to that ultimate goal. You know, that we are committed to creating this beloved community.
Sure. Thank you.
And we're focused on not just what will come out of it for me, but what's going to come out of it for all of us as a whole.
Thank you so much, Dr. King. Ambassador Young, what are your thoughts on bridging the gap?
You know, I'm much more well, I don't want it to sound, it's not in any way pious, but I sort of decided when I was about 19 that the thing that with the Quakers, the things that made sense to me was that there was, well, it says so in the New Testament, the kingdom of God is within. And almost every religion has some sense of awareness of divinity in humanity. And I think that, well, I really have never known what I'm doing, and I have never had a plan the day before it happened. But I mean, like, I was led to Marion, Alabama, you know, and I didn't want to go. I didn't want to go to, I didn't want to come to work with SCLC. You but my wife did.
Mm-hmm.
My wife was through with New York. She wanted to come back to the South. And I was comfortable in New York. See? And I think that nobody planned George Floyd's death. Nobody planned Bloody Sunday. In fact, Dr. King, I mean, we were surprised that people showed up on the wrong day. and it's like nothing that has happened in my life did I plan. And so, and in Islam, the Sufi section of Islam is very spiritual.
Yes.
And Hinduism and Buddhism also.
Mm-hmm.
That I've always been able to relate to men of God at a spiritual level. And I think that spirit is what leads us. It's not our plans, our strategies. In fact, the whole time we were in SCLC, nothing ever worked out as we planned it. But it happened as it was supposed to happen.
Right. Thank you so much, Ambassador Young. And now what we'll do is we'll begin to move to closing remarks. And so the order for that, we'll start with Dr. Heschel, and then we'll move to Ambassador Young, and then Dr. Bernice A. King. Dr. Heschel.
Oh, thank you. So it's just a wonderful gift to be able to be with all of you this evening. I thank you very much. And I want to say, first of all, how much I've always appreciated Bernice King, you, and also I want to say that your mother was a wonderful person, and she was so kind to me when my father died. And I want to express my gratitude to you for her kindness to me in the war. She was a great, great woman. I just would say that, on the one hand, when growing up, and I saw my father in the civil rights movement, and of course I understood what it would mean for a person of faith, of course, to oppose segregation, to oppose what was happening in the country, also with the Vietnam War, which was also a race war against people in Southeast Asia, and a race war against African Americans who were being sent over to fight for, to fight for something over there that they didn't have over here. But what was hard for me to understand later when I was a graduate student, when I started working on German history, was to understand how could it be that there were Protestants in Germany who supported Hitler, and Catholics too. How could that possibly be? So it gave me also a sense of the fragility of our relationship as religious people to issues of race and social justice. And that fragility is something that we have to cultivate and nurture and protect. That our faith and our commitment to this struggle right now against the racism of this country, against the economic inequality, the injustice, against the death penalty, the horror that's going on. That's really a very important obligation for us. It's important for the society, and it's important for each person's inner life. So I thank you for this opportunity for us to come together. It renews my spirits, and I express my gratitude to all of you.
Thank you so much. Ambassador Young, what are your final remarks?
I want to go back to Albany.
Okay.
Which was our failure, according to everybody. And yet, later on, Chief Pritchett, who was supposed to have bested Dr. King, put my name down as a reference for him to get out of Albany. And then the sergeant that called me names and mistreated me when I went into the jail to try to see Dr. King and Reverend Abernathy, I met him years later up in Maine, working in a country club as security. And he came up to me and he wasn't a, 300-pound fat man behind the desk. He was a tall, skinny, trimmed down, looked like a country club pimp in New England. And he shook my hand and said, "You don't remember me, do you?" And I said, "No, where from?" He said, "I'm Sergeant Hamilton from the Albany jail." He said, "As soon as you all left Albany, I realized I didn't want my children to grow up like I did. And I put them in the car with my family, and we got a job up here in security." I'm saying that the mayor that kind of put me in jail, here in Atlanta, ended up supporting me in my campaign and being one of my best friends. There is no way to lose in this fight unless you give up. And the one thing that I shouldn't do this, and forgive me, all of you, but the thing I missed about Black Lives Matter is nobody was singing. And so I thought of a song that I'd like to end with. I got a feeling everything's gonna be all right. I've got a feeling everything's gonna be all right. Be all right. Be all right. Be all right.
Hey, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you.
Amen.
And Dr. King, final remarks?
Before I get my final remarks, I just want to thank the Center for Civil and Human Rights, Jill Savitt, and all of her team, and my King Center team for bringing this conversation to you on tonight. I was born in 1963, March 28th to be exact. I think that's somewhere around 19 days before my father wrote this letter from the Birmingham Jail. So 63 is very important to me. It was a very important and critical turning point in the movement that my father led. And if we recall, 1963 was the same year that my father delivered his iconic message and speech. I would say his speech to the world, "I Have a Dream." And that was delivered on my 5th month of being here on the earth. And one thing he said to us in that speech, and at that time he was speaking specifically to the Black community, but this is a message to the world. He said, "In our quest for freedom, we must not drink from the cup of bitterness." And then he went on to say something that I hold on to every day of my life. "We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline." Mm-hmm. Tonight, this whole conversation really was about this high plane of dignity and discipline. Nonviolence is dignity. It's discipline. It gives people dignity. It gives people discipline. It is a moral foundation. It is a moral instrument. It is a moral way, and we should not be ashamed of morality. Morality is much broader than our religion. It's much deeper than our religion. It transcends our religion, in fact. And it calls us to that higher consciousness that we have regardless of who we are in our faith traditions. And even if you don't have a faith tradition, it's the very thing that connects us. And it's the one thing that our world desperately needs right now, because as Daddy reminded us in '67, and where do we go from here? Chaos of Community in the World House, that there's a tremendous lag between our scientific and technological advancement, which we thank God for, because that's what enables us to connect with you on today from around the world, is technology. But that progression cannot go well past our moral and ethical advancement, because if it does, if we continue to let that chasm grow, then at the end of the day, as he said, we're going to destroy ourselves in the misuse of our own instruments, and we perhaps will become an uncivilized world. And so I hope you were inspired by tonight's conversation. I hope that you will read and reread this letter for its relevance in today's time. And I hope you will understand that nonviolence, as Daddy said, is the ultimate way, that we still have a choice today. And that choice is nonviolence. He said it, it's not nonviolence or violence, it's nonviolence or non-existence. So really, we only have one choice and one pathway, and that is to the beloved community and being nonviolence. And we call it 365 because it is a way of life.
Thank you so much, Dr. King. And to each of the panelists, I just want to thank you so much for joining us tonight. From Dr. Carson, Dr. Heschel, Ambassador Andrew Young, and Dr. Bernice King, we thank you so much for participating tonight. We would also like to thank the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, as well as the King Center. And we also want to thank you, the audience, for tuning in, for joining us for such a powerful panel and conversation. A few notes, if you would like, to purchase a copy of Why We Can't Wait, which really recounts and recalls Dr. King's account of the nonviolent campaign in Birmingham, and it includes the letter from the Birmingham Jail, then you can do so. It is available for purchase at the King Center, which is www.thekingcenter.org. That is www.thekingcenter.org. Additionally, we would like to encourage everyone to please join the campaign for equal dignity. Go to the website, check it out, and please join that campaign as well. Once again, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and I hope you all have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.